This is the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it's not. It's a very small lake, might even be a pond. But in April 1912, just over 100 years ago, the RMS Titanic set sail across the waters of the Atlantic Ocean on its maiden voyage. You've heard this story before. A luxury liner, the largest of its time, strikes an iceberg and sinks. Over 1,500 lives were lost. It's a tragic tale that's been told countless times. But what if I told you a book had predicted almost the exact same disaster 14 years before it happened? Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, was published in 1898 by an author named Morgan Robertson, a former sailor with a deep understanding of naval engineering and maritime culture. His fictional ship, the Titan, was described as the largest vessel ever built, an engineering marvel, marketed as practically unsinkable. Does this sound familiar? The Titan, like the Titanic, was on its maiden voyage across the North Atlantic in April. It was speeding through icy waters when, surprise, surprise, it hits an iceberg. And of course, because this is a work of fiction, Robertson wrote that the Titan didn't have enough lifeboats for its passengers. Just like the Titanic in real life, the parallels between the two ships are so uncanny, you might think Robertson was a time traveler. But no, just a weird coincidence, and it's not the only one. History is filled with strange coincidences like this one, especially in literature. Take Edgar Allan Poe. You've probably heard of him. Master of horror writing, writer of The Raven. But did you know he predicted a real-life tragedy over 40 years before it happened? In Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, a shipwreck leaves its survivors stranded at sea. Eventually, they draw lots to decide who will be sacrificed and eaten. The unfortunate soul, a cabin boy named Richard Parker. While the story might sound outrageous to us today, maritime disasters and survival cannibalism were not unheard of in the 19th century. In fact, the story taps into a deep fear of the time, being lost at sea. Fast forward to 1884, 40 years after Poe's novel, and another shipwreck occurs. The crew of the Nickleby find themselves in exactly the same situation, stranded at sea with no food, and guess what? They also drew lots. And the cabin boy who gets eaten is named Richard Parker. What are the odds?
Go on, son.
Thank you, man. And if it wasn't strange enough, let me introduce you to someone called Jules Verne, a writer who was always thinking way ahead of his time. But he wasn't just a dreamer, he was deeply interested in scientific discoveries and innovations of the 19th century. In 1865, Verne published From the Earth to the Moon. You'd expect a bit of fiction, right? But get this, in Verne's novel, a crew launches to the moon from Florida in a spacecraft called the Columbiad. Over 100 years later, in 1969, Apollo 11 also launches to the moon from Florida, and the command module was called, wait for it, the Columbia. Okay, so the names aren't exactly the same, but we've got Florida, we've got a moon mission, and we've got a spacecraft name that's really, really close. Verne even got the return method right, a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, just like Apollo. Not bad for a guy writing in the 1800s. Now, not all literary coincidences are so accurate, but sometimes they're just plain creepy. In 1938, Dickens wrote Nickleby. One of the characters, called Smike, is a young man who suffers through a life of neglect and illness, and ultimately he dies of tuberculosis. But here's where it gets chilling. Fast forward to 1870, years after Nickleby was written, Dickens had a son named Sidney, who he affectionately called Smike. Many years after writing Nickleby, Dickens' son also died of tuberculosis. It's a tragic real-life parallel between the fate of a fictional character and a member of Dickens' own family. A coincidence no one could have predicted or wanted. And if we move forward in time, we find another eerie coincidence, this time about a vision of the future that predicted one of the most fundamental parts of our modern economy. In 1888, Edward Bellamy published Looking Backward, a utopian novel where the protagonist falls asleep in the 19th century and wakes up in the year 2000. Probably to fucking planes like this. In this new world, money as we know it is gone. Instead, people use something remarkably similar to credit cards. Bellamy's future society uses a credit system where citizens carry a physical card that's used to electronically deduct credits from their personal account, which they use to buy goods and services. Sounds familiar? This was written over 100 years before the invention of actual credit cards in the mid-20th century. And yet Bellamy's concept mirrors the system that we use today. The idea of carrying a card linked to a personal account for cashless transactions. He predicted it decades before it became reality. It wasn't just the idea of credit cards either. Bellamy predicted modern shopping malls where people would come to buy everything in one place. Well, he didn't get everything right. Flying cars and robot butlers are still a bit far off. His vision of consumerism was remarkably close to what we see today. So what do all these strange coincidences mean? Honestly, probably nothing. We could chalk it all up to chance, or maybe even the idea that life occasionally imitates art in ways we can't predict. But it's fascinating to think that books, just simple works of fiction, can sometimes mirror reality in ways that make us stop and wonder. The Titanic tragedy was one of the worst maritime disasters in history. but it wasn't unique. There were other ships that sank before and after. Yet it's that eerie coincidence with the wreck of the Titan that sticks in our minds. Maybe it's because deep down we want to believe that stories can see into the future. Maybe we just like a good mystery. Or maybe it's because we're always looking for patterns, even when they're not really there. Whatever the reason, these coincidences make for some great stories. And whether you're a believer in fate or just someone who enjoys the weird quirks of history, one thing is for sure: truth is stranger than fiction. Thanks for watching. And if you like this video, feel free to subscribe for more interesting bits of history, technology, and the strange coincidences that come with them. And I'll see you next time. Is it picking up that? I presume yes. It's a chainsaw. And the sun comes back. Let me introduce you. Oh, this bloody chainsaw. Look at this guy. Swapping his ball for a duck. Hello? No, okay. All right. Go on then.
Hey, come on, you. Don't need you on camera.
I can probably go straight away. No, never mind. The bottom of it, let's just see if it was.